The night sky hung heavy and liquid over the coastline, as if the sea itself had drawn a velvet curtain across the world. In the small town of Whitestone, whispers traveled faster than the ocean breeze. That evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and soft oranges, the townsfolk noticed something peculiar. From the cliffs above the jagged rocks, where waves crashed like the pounding of distant drums, a light shone steadily from the old lighthouse. Though no keeper had been seen tending to it for weeks, the lighthouse had always been the town's steadfast sentinel. Its brick walls, worn by decades of wind and salt, carried stories older than anyone still living in Whitestone. Generations of families had grown up under its watchful beam, relying on its steady glow to guide fishermen home and ships safely past the hidden reefs. But this night, the lighthouse defied expectation. Even as the chill of late autumn seeped into the bones of those who walked the streets below, the beacon burned unwaveringly, as if it had grown a life of its own. Old Martha Hensley, who had lived her entire 82 years in a house barely a stone's throw from the cliffs, was the first to remark on it. She had just returned from her evening walk with her terrier, Rocco, when she stopped mid-step, leaning heavily on her cane. "Well, I'll be," she muttered, eyes wide beneath her shawl. "Ain't nobody inside, and yet the light. It shines like it's waiting for someone." Curiosity stirred like a low tide in the town. Windows opened, doors cracked, and neighbors stepped into the streets, sharing glimpses and hushed theories. Some swore it was the work of mischievous spirits, a rumor that had clung to Whitestone like moss on stone walls for generations. Others, more pragmatic, suggested a wiring fault or some mechanical quirk of the lighthouse's old lens. But no one could explain how it glowed so steadily, so deliberately, as though responding to a summons only it understood. Children, their cheeks pink from the cold, pressed against frosted window panes, pointing excitedly at the steady light. "It's magic," one whispered, and the others nodded solemnly. Even the fishermen, grizzled men who had seen more storms than they cared to count, paused at the docks, letting the scent of salt water mingle with the rising unease and awe. "I've never seen anything like it," muttered Captain Tom, rubbing his beard. "Not in my 32 years at sea, that light. It's waiting, and I don't know for what." The lighthouse itself seemed to hum. A gentle vibration felt more than heard, as though its very walls resonated with the rhythm of the waves below. The massive Fresnel lens, an intricate prism of glass and metal, refracted the golden glow across the churning sea. Every beam seemed purposeful, deliberate, sweeping across the waves and illuminating the jagged cliffs with an ethereal precision. Those who watched felt a strange comfort mingled with unease, as if the light were both a guardian and a reminder of the sea's unpredictable power. Inside the town's tiny tavern, men and women gathered around the hearth, trading accounts of what they saw. The lighthouse had been abandoned since keeper Elias Rowan had vanished without a trace. No one had seen him in days. Some whispered that he had simply walked into the night, never to return. Others feared something more sinister, a fate entwined with the lighthouse itself. Yet, despite his absence, the beacon shone. It didn't falter when storms rolled in or when the wind howled across the cliffs. It remained steady, a silent witness to the town's rising curiosity and trepidation. By midnight, a small group of brave townsfolk decided to ascend the cliff path, drawn by a mixture of wonder and duty. Lanterns swung in their hands, casting elongated shadows against the rocky terrain. Among them was young Samuel Green, barely 17, whose father had been a fisherman lost to the sea years before. Samuel's fascination with the lighthouse was not new. He had spent countless evenings sketching its structure and dreaming of the day he might become a keeper himself. Now, as he climbed toward the source of the mysterious light, his heart thudded with anticipation and an almost sacred reverence. The climb was treacherous. Loose stones shifted underfoot, and the scent of brine hung thick in the air. Yet with each step, the lighthouse seemed to grow more alive. The light brighter, almost breathing in time with the pounding of the waves. When Samuel and the others reached the entrance, they paused. The great wooden door, weathered and swollen with salt, was ajar. A warm, inviting glow spilled from the interior, yet there was no sign of a keeper. The air was still, except for the distant roar of the ocean and the faint creak of the lighthouse as inner spiral staircase. Inside, the lighthouse was immaculate, almost impossibly so. Dust lay undisturbed, polished brass gleamed, and the familiar scent of candle wax mingled with the salty tang of the sea. At the top, the lens rotated slowly, the mechanics moving with perfect precision. Samuel's fingers itched to touch the controls, to see if some hidden mechanism or unseen hand could explain the phenomenon. Yet he hesitated, sensing that some mysteries were meant to be witnessed, not tampered with. Time passed differently in the lighthouse. Minutes stretched into hours, and the townsfolk, entranced, felt a quiet magic settle over them. Outside, the sea calmed as if responding to the lighthouse's glow, waves rolling gently rather than crashing violently. It was a rare, almost holy silence, broken only by the soft wind whispering through the cracks in the walls. Even Rocco, Martha Hensley's terrier, sat motionless on the floor, ears perked, as though he too recognized the significance of the light. Stories of the night spread through Whitestone for weeks afterward, carried in hushed tones across dinner tables in crowded markets. Travelers who happened upon the town claimed the lighthouse was alive, a sentient guardian guiding those in peril even without a human hand. Scholars who later visited theorized about complex gears and optics, but the townsfolk knew better. The lighthouse had chosen to shine, regardless of the absence of its keeper, bridging the space between the known and the unknowable, between the living and the lingering memory of keeper Elias Rowan. And when the sun finally began to rise over the horizon, casting pale gold across the sea, the townsfolk descended the cliffs, hearts still pounding with wonder. The light remained, steadfast and proud, a quiet defiance of reason. It had refused to fade, not out of habit or duty, but out of a silent, inexplicable determination. It became the first story many told their children, a tale not of fear, but of awe of the gentle, uncanny power that sometimes exists at the edges of human understanding. In the years that followed, the lighthouse never ceased to glow. Generations of Whitestone residents came and went, but the beacon remained. It witnessed weddings, farewells, births, and storms alike, a constant in an ever-changing world. And whenever a new keeper arrived, they were told the same truth whispered among the old-timers. The lighthouse keeps its own watch, and some nights it may shine for reasons no one living can ever understand. That night the beacon refused to fade became legend. It was a story of light in the absence of guidance, of unwavering hope, and of the mysteries that linger quietly along the edge of the sea. Whitestone learned that some guardians do not need hands to tend them. Some lights, once ignited, live on in defiance of the very shadows that would seek to extinguish them. The lingering glow of the lighthouse still shimmered in the memory of Whitestone's residents, a steadfast reminder of the sea's quiet dominion over their lives. Long before the lighthouse became a sentinel for lost sailors, Whitestone itself was born of the sea, carved from jagged cliffs and the stubborn will of its first settlers. The town had grown slowly, brick by brick, pier by pier, as fishermen and their families learned to navigate the whims of both ocean and weather. Generations had been forged in the rhythm of tides, their livelihoods tied to the salt-stung air and the unpredictable temper of the waves. The earliest records tell of the town's founding in the late 1700s, when a small band of hardy families seeking opportunity arrived on the rugged coastline. They were dreamers and survivors, escaping the constraints of inland towns, drawn by the promise of open water, fertile fishing grounds, and the chance to carve their own destiny. They built homes from the timber washed ashore and dug wells in the rocky soil, planting gardens that struggled against salty winds but thrived with careful attention. Storms were a constant companion. The first settlers learned quickly that the sea did not negotiate. Winter gales swept through Whitestone with terrifying regularity, tearing roofs from homes and uprooting trees that had taken decades to grow. Entire fishing fleets were lost in a single night when a sudden squall rose from nowhere, claiming lives with brutal impartiality. Yet the townsfolk endured. They rebuilt, mended nets, and stitched the torn sails of their livelihoods, passing down stories of resilience alongside the more practical knowledge of tides and wind patterns. Whitestone's proximity to the cliffs and reefs that guarded the harbor brought both fortune and danger. Fishermen who respected the currents and winds often returned with bountiful hauls, while those who ignored the subtle warnings of gulls and shifting clouds sometimes vanished without a trace. This gave rise to an unspoken reverence among the residents for the forces they could not control, a quiet acknowledgement that while they could harness the sea, they could never truly command it. The town's streets reflected its maritime character. Narrow lanes wound between weathered cottages, their walls bleached by salt and sun, chimneys puffing smoke that mingled with the briny air. Fishermen's knots and coils of rope hung from fences, drying in the wind. Small markets overflowed with salted cod, shellfish, and the occasional exotic item brought in by passing trade ships. Children darted between houses, laughing as their parents labored, learning early that the rhythm of Whitestone demanded both courage and vigilance. Whitestone's history was also shadowed by secrets carried on the sea breeze. Smugglers once used hidden coves along the cliffs to transport goods that never appeared in the town's records. Generations of sailors told tales of lost treasure buried in tidal pools, or of phantom ships glimpsed in the fog that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Even as the town grew, these stories were whispered more than shouted, a reminder that some truths were meant to linger in the fog rather than emerge into the light. Religious and cultural practices reflected the town's uneasy relationship with the sea. Every household, whether devout or not, maintained small shrines or tokens dedicated to protection, an old compass, a carved figurehead, or a simple stone set on the windowsill. Festivals were tied to the tides. The harvest of the sea in late summer celebrated both bounty and survival, with dances performed on the cliffs while bonfires flickered against the night sky. Even these celebrations carried an undertone of caution, a collective acknowledgement that the sea could take as easily as it gave. The town's governing structure was as much shaped by survival as it was by law. Elders and ship captains held sway over community decisions, their experience valued above formal authority. Decisions about when to fish, when to repair docks, or when to rebuild after a storm were matters of both practicality and trust. This reliance on wisdom over bureaucracy often led to quiet disagreements, as the younger generation chafed under traditions that sometimes seemed overly cautious. Yet when the sea roared and waves clawed at the town's edges, even the most rebellious youths learned quickly that experience was more reliable than enthusiasm alone. Whitestone also bore scars from moments of tragedy, which became woven into the fabric of its identity. The Great Gale of 1824, for example, claimed nearly a dozen homes and left families mourning lost fathers and sons. Communities rallied to rebuild, but the memory of that storm haunted every creaking pier and every windswept window. Similarly, the disappearance of entire fishing crews during particularly treacherous winters left a lingering cautionary tale, passed down in hushed tones. The lighthouse itself, erected in the aftermath of repeated shipwrecks, was a direct response to these losses, a practical solution born from grief and necessity. Despite hardships, the town's charm persisted. Whitestone's residents cultivated an intimate knowledge of the land and sea that outsiders found awe-inspiring. Fishermen could read the clouds as others read letters. Mothers warned children of the signs that storm waves were approaching, and elders spoke of currents that could pull a boat into the unknown within moments. Visitors often remarked on the town's serenity, not realizing that the calm was hard-won, a result of decades of respect and vigilance. Whitestone's quiet streets were the product of constant labor, tempered by stories and rituals that honored both the sea's generosity and its fury. The town's secrets, however, ran deeper than storms and shipwrecks. Beneath the cobbled streets and hidden alleys lay the remnants of old smuggling tunnels, places where illicit goods were hidden from authorities or rival sailors. Some families still maintained keys or maps passed down for generations, though the knowledge was mostly dormant, a quiet reminder of Whitestone's shadowed past. Other secrets were simpler but no less significant: lost loves, forgotten promises, and private pacts made with the sea to ensure safe passage. These layers of memory, both public and private, created a town where every corner held a story waiting to be recalled. By the time the lighthouse first began its nightly vigil, Whitestone had already become a town defined by duality, resilience and vulnerability, knowledge and mystery, joy and caution. Its inhabitants moved through life with an understanding that the sea could be both ally and adversary, shaping their routines, their rituals, and their relationships. Even the architecture of the town reflected this balance: homes built to withstand storms yet open enough to welcome the soft, salty wind. Streets aligned to guide fishermen safely to harbor, yet twisted in places to hide secrets from prying eyes. Whitestone's identity was inseparable from the water that surrounded it, each wave a reminder of history, survival, and unspoken stories. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the lighthouse's beam first pierced the early mist, the town seemed suspended between time and tide. The cliffs, the cottages, the weathered docks all held echoes of lives lived in deference to forces larger than themselves. Children slept soundly in homes that had weathered centuries of storms, unaware of the delicate balance maintained by generations of ancestors who had both dared and feared the sea. And while the lighthouse kept its vigil, the town waited, perpetually attentive, knowing that their survival, prosperity, and very identity were intertwined with the watery expanse that defined them. Whitestone, built on salt, storms, and secrets, was more than a town. It was a living testament to endurance and memory, to the quiet power of those who had come before. Each brick, each wooden beam, each whispered story carried the weight of a people who had learned to respect the sea not as a conquerable force, but as a teacher, a challenge, and sometimes a companion. And so the town thrived, quietly remarkable, a coastal community whose heart beat in time with the rolling waves and whose soul lingered in the glow of the ever-watchful lighthouse. The soft, steady glow of Whitestone's lighthouse had long been the town's heartbeat, and for Elias Rowan it was the pulse that defined every moment of his existence. Elias had been born in the town of Whitestone, a child of the cliffs and sea, and from his earliest memories, the lighthouse had loomed over his life like a silent guardian. As a boy, he had clambered up its spiraling stairs, his small fingers gripping the cold iron railings, marveling at how the vast ocean seemed to stretch endlessly beyond the horizon. His fascination deepened with age, and by the time he was a young man, he had become an apprentice to the keeper who tended the beacon before him. He learned to polish the lenses, maintain the lantern's flame, and chart the tides, all the while absorbing the solemn, almost sacred rhythm that governed the lighthouse. Elias's life was defined by routines so precise they bordered on ritual. Each day began before dawn, with a walk along the cliffs to inspect the coastline, checking for hazards that could threaten passing vessels. He would return to polish the brass fittings of the lens, ensuring that even a hint of dust could not diminish the light's clarity. Meals were simple, often consumed in silence while watching the waves crash below, a quiet acknowledgement of the sea's omnipresence in his life. Visitors were rare, and conversation was usually reserved for brief exchanges with fishermen or townsfolk, who brought news of storms or ships approaching the harbor. Yet even in this solitude, Elias found comfort. The lighthouse, in all its towering grandeur, was his companion, a steadfast presence that responded only to his care. He often spoke to it in low tones, murmured observations about the weather or the sea's temperament, as though the structure itself could understand and answer. Many townsfolk thought him eccentric, a man more in love with the building than with human company. But those who knew him understood that his devotion was not to stone and glass, but to the safety and survival of those who relied on the light he tended. The loneliness of the lighthouse weighed on him in subtle ways. Nights stretched long and quiet, the only sound the rhythmic creak of the spiral staircase and the distant roar of waves. Sometimes, during fierce storms, he would descend to the cliffs, standing in driving rain and howling wind, feeling the full force of the elements and realizing that he alone bore responsibility for the beacon's unwavering gaze. It was a burden he accepted willingly, though it left him hollow at times, a man tethered to duty and isolation in equal measure. Elias had a routine for recording his observations, a meticulous journal in which he documented the tides, the weather, and the passing ships. But more personal notes crept into the pages, reflections on the sea's moods, fleeting thoughts about the people he rarely saw, and at times, confessions of a yearning for human connection that the lighthouse could not provide. In these private entries, he wrote of dreams in which the light moved on its own, guiding vessels through fog and storms without any hand to steer it. He did not share these dreams, fearing they would be dismissed as fantasies of an overworked mind, yet they haunted him, a mysterious hint of something beyond his understanding. Over the years, strange events began to punctuate his otherwise methodical life. He would awaken in the dead of night to find a lantern flickering in patterns he had not set, or hear the faint echo of footsteps on the stairs when he was certain no one had entered. The beam occasionally shifted unexpectedly, casting its golden arcs over reefs that required no illumination, as if testing the waters for unseen dangers. Elias could not explain these phenomena, but he learned to trust the light, to follow its subtle guidance, even when it defied reason. Townsfolk too began to notice anomalies. Fishermen reported that on nights when Elias had been away or sick, the lighthouse still shone, sometimes with more intensity than usual, guiding lost ships to safety. Whispered tales emerged of a man seen at the top of the cliffs, invisible in the fog, moving in tandem with the light, as if he were both absent and present simultaneously. Elias heard these stories and smiled faintly, though a shadow of unease lingered. He understood that the lighthouse had begun to develop a life of its own, a companion and guardian that sometimes acted independently of its keeper. Despite the growing mysteries, Elias maintained his routines with unwavering discipline. He rose each morning with the sun, inspected the lens, climbed the staircase to ensure the lantern was functioning flawlessly, and tended to the surrounding grounds. His meals remained simple, often consisting of bread, cheese, and fish caught from the harbor below. Letters from townsfolk and distant relatives accumulated unopened, as his commitment to the lighthouse left little room for distractions. Friends came and went, some expressing concern for his solitary existence, but Elias knew that the lighthouse was his true family, and the sea his constant confidant. In the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Elias grew more introspective. He would stand at the cliff's edge for hours, staring into the horizon, contemplating the delicate balance between human effort and the untamable power of the sea. The light in the lighthouse seemed to respond to his moods, brightening when he felt anxious and dimming slightly when he was calm. This strange synchrony both comforted and unnerved him. He began to leave small offerings along the walls, coins, trinkets, and scraps of paper inscribed with cryptic messages, hoping to appease whatever unseen force had begun to interact with the beacon. One evening, a violent storm rolled in, unlike any Whitestone had seen in decades. Winds lashed against the cliffs, waves shattered against the rocks, and rain fell in sheets so thick that even the lighthouse's glow struggled to pierce the darkness. Elias tended the lantern with steady hands, watching the light dance across the tempestuous waters. Yet in a moment of distraction, he thought he glimpsed a figure atop the cliffs, an apparition, pale and indistinct, moving with a grace that seemed both human and otherworldly. He turned to speak, but the figure vanished, leaving only the roar of the storm and the unwavering beam of the lighthouse to guide him. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving a quiet, almost surreal calm over Whitestone. Villagers emerged from their homes, checking the docks and counting the fleet. No one had seen Elias during the night, and though the lighthouse continued to shine as brightly as ever, a sense of unease settled over the town. His quarters were untouched, journals open to pages filled with neat handwriting, but there was no sign of him. The doors remained unlocked, the stairway undisturbed, yet the man who had devoted his life to the light had vanished without explanation. Speculation ran rampant. Some believed Elias had been claimed by the sea, swept away during the storm in a tragic accident. Others whispered that he had finally succumbed to the loneliness that had shadowed him for decades, choosing to walk into the mist and disappear into the horizon. But the lighthouse, unyielding and steadfast, continued to glow as if Elias had never left, performing its nightly vigil with the same devotion that he had instilled in it. In this the townsfolk found both solace and bewilderment, a reminder that the light had become something greater than the man who tended it. Elias Rowan's disappearance became legend. The lighthouse, which had once been an extension of his will, now seemed almost sentient, guiding ships and illuminating the treacherous cliffs with a silent intelligence. Fishermen swore that on certain nights they could see the faint outline of a man in the glow, standing at the lantern, watching over them as he had in life. Children were told tales of the devoted keeper who never truly left, whose spirit lingered in the hum of the lantern and the steady sweep of the beam. For years afterward, the lighthouse continued its silent work, a symbol of dedication, mystery, and quiet guardianship. Whitestone's residents learned to trust the light, to respect its unspoken rules, and to honor the man who had devoted his life to it. While Elias Rowan's fate remained unknown, the legacy of his devotion endured, etched into the walls of the lighthouse and carried on the wind across the cliffs and harbor. The burden of the lonely light had been shared, not by a single man, but by the town and the sea, united in their reverence for a presence that transcended human understanding. And so the story of Keeper Elias Rowan lived on not merely as a tale of disappearance, but as a testament to quiet endurance, devotion in solitude, and the strange, enduring bond between a man and the light that refused to dim, even in the absence of its keeper. Even after Elias Rowan vanished, the lighthouse's unwavering beam cast a familiar glow across the restless sea, and with it came a new kind of murmur, soft as the tide yet impossible to ignore. Fishermen returning from early morning hauls first noticed it. They had grown accustomed to the sound of the waves lapping against the hulls of their boats, the steady slap of water against the docks, and the cry of gulls circling the harbor. But one morning, as the fog hung low and heavy over the cliffs, some claimed they heard something else, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to come from beneath the waves themselves. At first, they dismissed it as the wind funneling through the rocks or the groan of old timbers. Yet over the following days the whispers grew more distinct, echoing names, sometimes calling out Elias, other times a soft sigh that sounded eerily human. Captain Tom, who had lost a brother to the treacherous reefs decades earlier, was among the first to speak of it openly. "Aye," he said one morning at the docks, voice low and serious. "It's not the wind I hear, nor the ocean as I've known it. It's something else. A voice, or perhaps more than one, echoing the name of the keeper who never came back." His words caused a stir among the other fishermen, many of whom had known Elias Rowan personally. Some laughed it off, attributing it to grief or superstition. Others, however, felt a chill that would not subside. The whispers did not remain confined to the early hours. Sailors on distant waters reported hearing them while steering their vessels near the cliffs. A young deckhand aboard the cargo ship Haven's Pride swore that as the sun sank low behind the horizon, he could hear his father's voice mixed with another softer, gentler repeating the name Elias over and over. By the time he returned to Whitestone, his hands trembled as he recounted the story, leaving seasoned sailors unnerved by the prospect that the lighthouse and its missing keeper were connected to phenomena they could neither explain nor dismiss. The town's elders convened quietly to discuss the strange occurrences. They were men and women who had spent decades navigating the perils of the sea. and most were no strangers to superstition or legend. Yet even they could not provide an explanation for the sounds emanating from beneath the waves. Some suggested that Elias had somehow merged with the lighthouse, becoming one with its light and the waters it guarded. Others speculated that the sea itself had claimed him, but allowed fragments of his consciousness to linger, calling to those who remained. These theories were spoken in hushed tones, for fear that too much attention might anger forces beyond human understanding. Whispers spread among Whitestone's residents like currents weaving through tide pools. Children playing near the cliffs would pause mid-step, eyes widening as a faint murmur drifted to them on the wind. Farmers tending to coastal fields would stop to listen, convinced for brief moments that Elias was speaking to them, warning them, or simply observing from a place unseen. Even the lighthouse itself seemed to respond. The beam would sometimes shift, momentarily brighter or dimmer, as though acknowledging those who were listening or guiding them in subtle, unspoken ways. The mystery drew a handful of outsiders intrigued by tales of the supernatural. Scholars, journalists, and amateur ghost hunters ventured to Whitestone, hoping to witness the phenomenon firsthand. They recorded the waves, the fog, and the patterns of the light, yet when they played back their recordings, the whispers were either absent or too faint to be discerned. Residents found this both comforting and frustrating. Comforting because the mystery remained theirs, and frustrating because outsiders' disbelief failed to acknowledge the strange intimacy of the sounds. Fishermen began to adapt to the whispers. Some found it helpful, interpreting the voices as warnings of shifting tides, unseen rocks, or impending storms. A vessel that might have run aground in fog was steered safely past jagged cliffs, guided by a soft, beckoning murmur that seemed to emanate from nowhere yet everywhere at once. The whispers became a part of life in Whitestone, subtle yet influential, shaping decisions and movements as much as the physical presence of the lighthouse itself. At night, the cliffs became a place of pilgrimage. Small groups of townsfolk would ascend the rocky paths, lanterns in hand, drawn by a combination of reverence, curiosity, and perhaps a need for connection. They would stand at the edge, listening as the waves curled against the rocks, and there, in the rhythmic pulse of water and wind, they sometimes swore they could hear Elias's voice clearly. Some claimed he spoke of the sea's moods, of ships to watch, of dangers unseen. Others described a more personal tone, a voice echoing concern for the townsfolk themselves, a guardian who had chosen to remain unseen yet attentive. Not everyone embraced these whispers with comfort. A few, more skeptical or easily unnerved, reported feelings of unease or even fear. One elderly woman, known for her composure, claimed that at night she would hear the whispers shift from gentle guidance to something more insistent, almost demanding, as though Elias or the force tied to him sought acknowledgement, obedience, or recognition. The town's ministers and spiritual leaders offered prayers and gatherings to soothe anxious hearts, framing the phenomenon as a mysterious blessing rather than a threat. Elias's journals, recovered by the town after his disappearance, offered fragments of insight into what might be occurring. In them, he wrote of dreams in which the lighthouse light stretched across the water and spoke in subtle ways, carrying messages from the depths of the ocean. He described sensations of being tethered simultaneously to the land and the sea, a dual existence that allowed him to act as intermediary between the living and the unknown forces of nature. Scholars later examined these notes and concluded that Elias's intuition and meticulous care might have imbued the lighthouse and perhaps even the surrounding waters with an energy that persisted after his disappearance. As years passed, the whispers became an integral part of Whitestone's identity. Fishermen relied on them, children grew up hearing them as lullabies mingled with the roar of waves, and visitors marveled at the town where the sea seemed alive with unseen voices. Some nights, when the fog was thick and the wind carried a faint chill, the whispers seemed to coalesce into faint melodies, harmonizing with the rhythm of the lighthouse beam as though Elias's presence had not been lost but transformed, woven into the very fabric of the town's coastal existence. A handful of skeptics remained, insisting that the sounds were merely echoes, the result of wind and water interacting in strange acoustics, or the imagination of a community steeped in maritime legend. But those who lived closest to the cliffs, the fishermen, the lighthouse volunteers, the children who played near the rocks, knew better. They felt the voice of Elias in a way that defied logic, a gentle reminder of the man who had devoted himself to vigilance, care, and the delicate balance between human effort and nature's immensity. Through it all, the lighthouse continued to shine, its unwavering beam stretching across the water and illuminating the cliffs where whispers often seemed strongest. The town learned to move in harmony with both the light and the murmurs beneath the waves, understanding that their safety and connection to the past were intertwined with the unseen presence that had once walked among them in human form. In essence, the whispers had become a language, a subtle guidance system, a guardian's voice woven into the fabric of Whitestone itself. And so the legend of Elias Rowan grew, not as a tale of disappearance, but as a story of transcendence. The whispers beneath the waves were a bridge between the mortal and the mysterious, a link between the lighthouse's enduring glow and the man who had once tended it with unwavering dedication. Whitestone became a town defined not only by its salts, storms, and secrets, but by the subtle, persistent echoes of the keeper whose name continued to resonate in every wave, every gust of wind, and every turn of the lighthouse's steady light. The sea, once a symbol of danger and uncertainty, had become a conduit for memory and guardianship. Each whisper reminded the townsfolk that even in absence, devotion endures. Even in silence, guidance persists. And for those who paused to listen closely, the echoes of Elias Rowan were both comforting and haunting, a gentle reminder that some bonds between human and sea, keeper and light, life and legend cannot be broken, not even by time, distance, or disappearance. The whispers beneath the waves had settled into the town's memory, and soon the beam of the lighthouse itself began to draw attention in ways that unsettled and fascinated Whitestone's residents alike. It began with a small group of fishermen who stayed late at the docks one evening, watching the lighthouse across the jagged cliffs. The sky was clear, the stars mirrored in the gently rippling water, when they noticed a subtle anomaly. The beam of the lighthouse, which was supposed to follow a steady, predictable rotation, seemed to shift slightly out of its usual path. It swept over the rocks and into areas where no ship should have been, lingering for moments that felt almost deliberate. The men exchanged uneasy glances, half convinced that their eyes were deceiving them, half certain that something extraordinary was unfolding before them. Word of the unusual movements spread quickly. By the next night, a handful of townsfolk had gathered on the cliffs, drawn by curiosity and an unspoken sense of awe. They were a mix of young and old, fishermen and shopkeepers, all aware of Elias Rowan's legacy and the recent tales of whispers beneath the waves. They watched as the lighthouse's golden arc traced patterns that seemed to respond to the motion of the sea itself, lingering on the crests of waves and highlighting the tips of the jagged reefs. Some swore it was as if the light were scanning for danger, guiding invisible travelers, or perhaps communicating with some unseen presence below the water. The town soon labeled these observers the Night Watchers, a group who returned nightly to monitor the phenomenon. They would bring lanterns and blankets, whispering theories to each other as the cool coastal wind carried the scent of salt and storm. Occasionally, they reported seeing faint shadows moving along the cliffs, figures that appeared and disappeared in the haze of moonlight and mist. Some speculated that it was the lingering spirit of Elias Rowan himself, still connected to the lighthouse and guiding the light in his absence. Others offered more mundane explanations, pointing to fog, reflection, and trickery of the human eye. Though even the skeptics could not fully dismiss the strangeness of the observations. One particularly clear night, a group of night watchers noticed the beam focusing more intensely than usual on a small cove where no vessel should have been present. As the light swept over the water, they thought they glimpsed the silhouette of a small boat, rocked gently by the tide. Though no one had reported a ship in the area, the lighthouse's arc seemed almost conscious in its motion, lingering over the spot long enough to illuminate the rocks and reveal subtle currents that would have endangered any vessel attempting to pass unseen. The watchers murmured to one another in hushed tones, unsure whether to feel awe or fear, yet captivated by the beam's apparent agency. The lighthouse's behavior became increasingly intricate. It would shift and pause in patterns that seemed almost rhythmic, coordinating with the movement of the tide, the rise and fall of the waves, and the gusts of the coastal wind. On several occasions, the light appeared to follow the wake of a ship approaching the harbor, though Elias Rowan was long gone and no human hand tended the controls. Townsfolk began to speculate that the light itself had developed a consciousness, a remnant of the keeper's devotion that had somehow survived in the mechanics of the lens, in the oil of the lantern, or perhaps in something altogether more mysterious. Among the night watchers was Lydia Marston, a young woman whose father had been a sailor lost to the sea many years prior. Lydia had grown up hearing the stories of Elias Rowan, the lighthouse, and the whispers beneath the waves. She became fascinated by the way the light seemed to act autonomously, convinced that it was communicating with the town and with those who had been lost to the ocean. On clear nights, she would record the movements of the beam, noting patterns, anomalies, and moments when the light lingered on specific points along the cliffs. Her journals, much like Elias's own records, became a repository of observation, curiosity, and wonder. Over time, the behavior of the lighthouse prompted a mixture of reverence and caution. Sailors returning from the sea spoke of navigating by its shifting arcs, claiming the light seemed to anticipate dangers that even the most experienced captains could not detect. Fishermen adapted their routines to align with the lighthouse's subtle guidance, altering the timing of their departures and landings to match the movement of the beam. And yet, even as the light proved helpful, it carried an aura of the unknown, a reminder that Whitestone's guardian might not be entirely predictable or human in nature. Visitors from nearby towns arrived, hoping to witness the phenomenon for themselves. They would stand on the cliffs with the night watchers, observing as the lighthouse's beam danced across the rocks and water. Some took photographs or sketched the patterns, though often the recordings failed to capture the subtleties that the human eye could detect. The residents of Whitestone, having long learned to live in harmony with the peculiarities of the coast, watched with a mix of pride and amusement, recognizing that outsiders could see only part of the lighthouse's secret life. Local legends grew richer with these observations. Stories circulated of Elias Rowan's spirit merging with the lighthouse, allowing him to continue his vigilance even after his disappearance. Some claimed that the light had a will of its own, sometimes helping vessels, sometimes moving in ways that served no immediately apparent purpose, but always in harmony with the town's history and the safety of its people. The lighthouse became more than a structure. It was a living emblem of connection between land, sea, and memory, a symbol that the devotion of one man could ripple through generations. On stormy nights, the light's movements became particularly dramatic. Gusts of wind and sheets of rain made navigation treacherous. Yet the lighthouse's beam cut through the darkness with precision and purpose. The night watchers, huddled beneath cloaks and umbrellas, watched in awe as the light highlighted dangerous rocks, guided waves away from the cliffs, and swept across the harbor with calculated arcs. These nights reinforced the idea that the lighthouse was both guardian and guide, its movements deliberate, almost sentient, as if it were aware of the town's needs and the perils beyond the cliffs. Some skeptics among the townsfolk remained cautious, arguing that mechanical quirks or optical illusions explained the behavior of the beam. Yet even they could not deny the uncanny precision of its movements, nor the pattern of guidance it provided to vessels near and far. Over the years, the lighthouse's reputation as an autonomous presence became intertwined with the identity of Whitestone itself. The town's relationship with the sea had always been one of respect and vigilance, but now it was also one of quiet wonder, awe, and cautious reverence. As the phenomenon continued, Lydia Marston and other night watchers took it upon themselves to study the lighthouse, developing a careful observation schedule and documenting every deviation from its usual rotation. They recorded weather conditions, tide patterns, and the behavior of the beam, seeking to understand whether there was a logic behind the seemingly autonomous movements. Over time, they noted that the light often moved in response to environmental changes, aligning itself with the rise of the tide, shifts in wind direction, and even the faint outlines of ships approaching the harbor under cover of darkness. For the people of Whitestone, the lighthouse became a symbol of continuity and hope. Generations grew up with stories of the beam's mysterious movements and the night watchers who observed them. Sailors and fishermen trusted the light, even in the absence of its original keeper, recognizing that something extraordinary had been imbued into its mechanisms or into the very spirit of the place. The light, they believed, was both a protector and a reminder that vigilance, care, and devotion, whether human or otherwise, could endure across time and circumstance. Ultimately, the tale of the night watchers and the moving light became part of Whitestone's cultural fabric. Children heard the stories as they grew up, and the town adapted its routines to respect and follow the guidance of the lighthouse's autonomous beam. Even as outsiders questioned the phenomenon, the residents understood that it was not merely a matter of physics or optics, but of memory, legacy, and an enduring connection to Elias Rowan and the guardianship he had instilled. The lighthouse continued to shine each night, its golden arcs tracing paths over water and cliffs, an eternal vigil that blurred the line between man and machine, between presence and absence. And through it all, the night watchers remained, dedicated observers of a light that moved with a life of its own, guiding, warning, and reminding Whitestone of the mysteries that lie at the intersection of devotion, legend, and the eternal rhythm of the sea. The autonomous glow of the lighthouse had become a comfort and a mystery to Whitestone, but on the night of the great storm of 1894, it proved that its vigilance was more than legend. It was a force that would shape lives in ways no one could anticipate. It began like many storms in Whitestone, with a sudden shift in the wind and a heavy, ominous cloud bank rolling across the horizon. Fishermen noticed the tide turning quicker than usual, and seagulls vanished from the cliffs as the air grew thick with the scent of incoming rain. By late afternoon, the harbor was a flurry of activity, nets being secured, boats tied down, and families hurrying to shutter windows and brace their homes. Whitestone had seen storms before, some of which had claimed lives and livelihoods. But there was an uncanny intensity to this one that set even the most seasoned residents on edge. Captain Tom, now in his 50s and seasoned by decades at sea, watched the horizon with a sense of foreboding. He had always trusted the lighthouse, even after Elias Rowan's disappearance, but tonight something about the light's behavior seemed different. It pulsed with urgency, brighter and longer than usual, sweeping in arcs that appeared to anticipate the waves' rise and crash. The night watchers, already stationed along the cliffs, noted the unusual rhythm, exchanging worried glances. This storm, they understood instinctively, would not be survived by ordinary caution alone. By evening, the tempest had intensified, with wind whipping in from the northeast. Gusts powerful enough to knock over barrels and send loose shingles flying from rooftops. Rain came in torrents, blurring the line between sea and sky, and the cliffs were slick with water, making the narrow paths treacherous for anyone attempting to descend. Yet the lighthouse remained steadfast, its beam cutting through the darkness and reaching across the water like a golden sword, marking safe passage with precision that no human hand could have maintained under such conditions. It was during this storm that ships, caught off guard by the sudden fury of the elements, found themselves struggling against the waves. The Mariner's Hope, a merchant vessel returning from Boston, had been driven perilously close to the jagged reefs near Whitestone. Its captain, a cautious man unfamiliar with the local waters, could see only the faint outline of rocks emerging from the dark, and he feared the worst. Yet the lighthouse's beam shifted in a way that guided him past the reefs, illuminating each treacherous jut of stone and leading the ship safely to the harbor entrance. Sailors aboard later swore that the light seemed to anticipate the waves' movement, shifting almost in concert with the ocean itself. Meanwhile, another vessel, the Sea Falcon, a small fishing boat with a crew of 5, was similarly caught in the storm. They had underestimated the speed at which the weather could turn, and the waves battered their craft relentlessly. As the storm raged, the lighthouse's beam danced across the water, and the crew realized they had a slim chance at survival if they followed its guidance. With desperate precision, they maneuvered toward the illuminated safe channels, narrowly avoiding the reefs that had claimed so many lives in past winters. When the storm finally passed, the men credited their survival not to skill alone but to the unwavering guidance of the lighthouse, its beam moving with a life of its own as if it were saving them deliberately. Back in Whitestone, the night watchers documented every anomaly. They noticed that the light often lingered on areas where no known ship was present, guiding invisible entities as if the lighthouse itself were aware of threats they could not see. Lydia Marston, who had spent years studying the lighthouse's peculiar behaviors, recorded the storm in meticulous detail, noting how the beam seemed to respond to the rhythm of the waves and to movements within the water. Her observations were later used to teach generations of sailors to respect both the power of the lighthouse and the treacherous currents around Whitestone. What made the storm of 1894 extraordinary, however, was not only the survival of those it guided, but also the unexpected manner in which it intervened. Reports came in afterward that vessels whose captains had ignored warnings or taken risky shortcuts were inexplicably spared, their paths illuminated just long enough to avoid catastrophe, only for the light to shift at the last possible moment, ensuring the safety of even those who might not have been deserving of it. Locals began to speak of the lighthouse as a moral guardian, its autonomous movements imbued with a sense of justice and care that defied explanation. The aftermath of the storm was equally remarkable. Whitestone emerged largely unscathed, thanks in part to the lighthouse-esque guidance and in part to the collective preparation of its residents. Boats that might have been lost were brought safely to harbor, and families whose homes had been at risk weathered the gale with minimal damage. Yet the event left an indelible mark on the town, reinforcing the notion that the lighthouse was more than mere structure. It was a sentinel, a protector, and a mysterious force connected to the spirit of Elias Rowan and the collective memory of the community. Stories of the storm spread far beyond Whitestone. Sailors traveling along the coast recounted tales of a light that moved with intention, guiding those in peril while leaving some to test the limits of fortune and skill. Newspapers reported on the event, describing the lighthouse as an enigmatic beacon of uncanny foresight and hinting at supernatural forces at play. Travelers came to Whitestone, eager to witness the lighthouse's behavior and to hear firsthand the accounts of the night watchers who had observed the storm. The town, long accustomed to quiet reverence for the sea, suddenly found itself at the center of regional fascination. Yet for those who lived closest to the cliffs, the storm of 1894 was not merely a spectacle. It was a confirmation of something they had sensed all along. The lighthouse's autonomous movements, the whispers beneath the waves, and the beam's precise guidance during life-threatening conditions all pointed to a force that was deeply intertwined with both the town's history and the legacy of Elias Rowan. The night watchers, once casual observers, became guardians themselves, documenting each anomaly, sharing their knowledge, and ensuring that the lighthouse's lessons were preserved for future generations. In the decades that followed, the storm of 1894 became a defining chapter in Whitestone's identity. Children grew up hearing tales of the lighthouse saving lives in the dead of night, of beams that moved with intelligence, and of the enduring presence of Elias Rowan in some form or another. Fishermen and sailors respected the lighthouse not only as a navigational aid, but as a living entity whose movements, patterns, and guidance were both mysterious and reliable. The storm reinforced a lesson that had been passed down through generations. Vigilance, respect, and harmony with the sea were as vital as courage and skill. The lighthouse itself remained unchanged in form, yet its reputation grew immeasurably. Residents maintained it meticulously, polishing the lens, tending to the lantern, and observing its behavior with a mixture of scientific curiosity and reverent awe. Even long after the storm had passed, the beam continued to move with the same uncanny precision, guiding vessels and illuminating cliffs with a sense of purpose that seemed almost sentient. Whitestone had learned that the lighthouse's power was not merely physical but symbolic, a beacon of hope and guidance that transcended the human hand that once maintained it. Stories from the storm also fostered a sense of community. Residents who had witnessed the event, assisted sailors, or helped secure boats in the harbor shared a collective memory of fear, awe, and survival. Families gathered to recount their experiences. Neighbors supported one another through the damage and uncertainty, and a deep respect for both the sea and the lighthouse was reinforced. The event became a cultural touchstone, a reminder that Whitestone's history, geography, and identity were inseparably linked to the forces that shaped its coastline. Even today, sailors navigating near Whitestone remember the tales of the storm of 1894. They speak in hushed tones of a lighthouse that moves with purpose, of a beam that guides those in danger, and of a legacy that refuses to fade. The night watchers, past and present, continue to monitor the light, noting its patterns, marveling at its precision, and teaching new generations to honor the mysteries of the coast. In this way, the storm of 1894 lives on not merely as a historical event, but as a testament to vigilance, care, and the extraordinary ways in which a single structure, imbued with devotion and memory, can shape the lives of all who depend upon it. Whitestone's lighthouse had proven that night that even forces beyond comprehension could act with purpose and compassion. Its autonomous guidance had saved lives that might otherwise have been lost, confirmed the whispers beneath the waves, and reinforced the town's belief in the enduring power of devotion, human or otherwise. The storm of 1894 became more than a tale of survival. It became a symbol of trust, vigilance, and the mysterious, enduring bond between the town, the lighthouse, and the memory of Elias Rowan. The lighthouse stood silent, its golden beams sweeping over the cliffs as if unaware of the decades that had passed since Elias Rowan's disappearance. Yet the discovery beneath its floorboards would make the past echo louder than ever. It began when Lydia Marston, now an experienced lighthouse volunteer, was performing routine maintenance. The floorboards in Elias's former quarters had creaked under countless footsteps over the years, and one night, while inspecting a corner of the room where the boards met the wall, she noticed a slight irregularity aboard that seemed less worn than the others. Kneeling, she pried it gently and discovered a small rusted tin, its lid barely holding against corrosion. Her heart quickened. Inside were letters, yellowed with age, written in Elias Rowan's precise hand, folded carefully as if each word had been meant to survive the passage of time. The first letter was brief, a note of reflection on his duties and the isolation he had endured. It spoke of his devotion to the lighthouse, his respect for the sea, and the unshakable rhythm of his daily life. Yet even in these early lines, there was an undertone of unease, a subtle awareness that his connection to the light and the water might transcend ordinary explanation. "The sea does not forgive," he wrote, "nor does it forget. The lighthouse is more than stone and glass. It is a keeper of both safety and secret truths, and I fear it may one day reveal them when I am not present to guide it." The next letters revealed his memories, carefully recorded reflections on his youth and early days as a lighthouse apprentice. He described the cliffs, the waves, and the storms he had weathered, noting how each event seemed to shape the light as much as he shaped it. Elias wrote of solitary nights, when the wind shrieked through the towers and the waves crashed against the rocks, and how he sometimes imagined that the lighthouse responded to his thoughts and fears. The words were meticulous yet filled with a strange tenderness, as though he was documenting both a life of duty and the heartbeat of something larger than himself. Some letters were warnings, cryptic and ominous, written in a tone that conveyed urgency even decades later. He spoke of storms that would rise without notice, of tides that could hide rocks beneath deceptively calm waters, and of the lighthouse's autonomous movements. "Do not assume the light is merely mechanical," he cautioned. "It listens, it observes, and it acts. The sea speaks through it, and in my absence, it may choose paths you cannot predict. Respect it, and heed its guidance. But do not attempt to command it as you would a man or a vessel." Other letters revealed his fears, the anxieties he had never shared with the townsfolk. He worried that his absence might leave the town vulnerable, that his devotion alone could not sustain the balance between human care and natural force. He wrote of dreams in which the lighthouse's beam shifted of its own accord, illuminating dangers he could not fully perceive. There was a sense of dread that underlay the practical observations, as if he understood that the lighthouse, once entrusted to human hands, could evolve into something beyond human comprehension. The letters also spoke of Elias's memories of the townspeople, their lives intertwined with the lighthouse and the sea. He recounted moments of quiet connection, the laughter of children playing near the cliffs, fishermen returning safely to the harbor, and families huddled in homes while storms raged. Yet he tempered these recollections with warnings, noting that the town's reliance on the lighthouse could become perilous if they mistook its presence for a guarantee, rather than a guide. "They must learn to read its movements as they would read the sea itself," he wrote. "The light will show the way, but wisdom and vigilance must come from within them." Among the letters were cryptic messages, short notes that hinted at forces beyond observation. He spoke of whispers beneath the waves, of the subtle rhythm of the tides, and of patterns in the light that were not visible to the casual observer. These writings suggested that Elias had perceived a connection between the lighthouse, the ocean, and himself, a bond that continued after his disappearance. "The beam is alive in ways you cannot yet comprehend," one note stated. "It carries memory, guidance, and perhaps even judgment. Watch, listen, and learn. Do not presume that all is under human control." As Lydia read through the rusted tin, she felt a shiver of both awe and apprehension. Each letter deepened her understanding of Elias Rowan, the man who had devoted his life to the light, and of the mysterious ways in which the lighthouse seemed to operate. The warnings were clear. The sea and the lighthouse were entwined, their power not to be underestimated. Yet Elias's tone was not solely fearful. There was also reverence, an acknowledgement of the extraordinary role the lighthouse played in preserving life and guiding the town. The discovery of the letters reignited curiosity among the night watchers and the town's older residents. They gathered in Elias's former quarters, reading aloud passages to one another, tracing his meticulous handwriting, and sharing memories of times when the lighthouse's autonomous behavior had saved lives. The letters provided context for events they had observed but never understood, the lingering whispers beneath the waves, the seemingly deliberate arcs of the beam, and the uncanny way the light had guided even the unprepared or unwary to safety. As the townsfolk absorbed the contents of the tin, a deeper appreciation for Elias's foresight emerged. He had understood that the lighthouse in his absence would continue to act, guided by a force he had nurtured through decades of care and observation. He had left instructions, memories, and warnings not as a plea for attention, but as a legacy for those who would follow him, an insistence that vigilance, respect, and attentiveness to the unknown were as important as the mechanical routines of tending the light. The letters also revealed Elias's humanity in ways the town had never fully grasped. He wrote of loneliness, longing, and fear, but also of joy in small moments. The calm after a storm, the sight of a returning ship, the beauty of the sun rising over the cliffs. In these passages, Lydia and the night watchers found not only historical insight, but a connection across time, as if Elias were speaking to them directly from the past, reminding them that the balance of duty and wonder is delicate and precious. By the time Lydia finished cataloging the letters, the rusted tin had become a sacred object. Its contents illuminated the mind and heart of Elias Rowan, revealing a man who had seen beyond the ordinary and understood the extraordinary responsibility he bore. The town, inspired by these writings, strengthened its commitment to observing and respecting the lighthouse, honoring both the light and the memory of its devoted keeper. Through the rusted tin, Elias's voice persisted. His final warnings echoed in the minds of those who read them, urging careful attention to the sea, humility before its power, and respect for the subtle intelligence of the lighthouse. Whitestone learned anew that its safety and survival were intertwined with the vigilance of one man long gone, and with the extraordinary legacy he had left behind, a lighthouse that shone not merely as a beacon, but as a living testament to care, memory, and the enduring bond between human and ocean. After decades of golden beams slicing through fog and storm, Whitestone's lighthouse pulsed with a light unlike any the townsfolk had ever seen, a gentle, eerie blue that painted the cliffs and waves with a spectral calm. It was Lydia Marston who first noticed it while standing on the cliffs alongside the night watchers. The wind carried the scent of salt and rain from a recent storm, and the waves had not yet returned to their usual rhythm, lingering in a restless agitation that seemed to match the unusual glow. At first, she thought her eyes were deceiving her, perhaps reflecting the moonlight in a peculiar way, but the others soon confirmed the change. The lighthouse's lantern was no longer gold. It shimmered blue, steady yet alive, as though communicating a message the town had never received before. A hush fell over the cliffs as townsfolk gathered to watch. Fishermen, shopkeepers, and children who had grown up hearing tales of the lighthouse's strange behaviors stared in awe. The night watchers whispered among themselves, speculating what the blue glow could mean. Some believed it was a warning of danger, a signal of unusual tides, or a storm yet to arrive. Others thought it might be Elias Rowan, or the spirit of the lighthouse itself, attempting to impart knowledge long withheld. The air was thick with anticipation and wonder, the way it always was when the sea seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The blue light stretched across the water, tracing paths over the jagged cliffs and illuminating coves where fishermen had long feared to tread. Its glow was softer than the golden arcs, yet it carried a presence that seemed to reach into the hearts of those watching. There was no fear in it, only a quiet insistence that the town observe, understand, and reflect. Lydia felt a shiver run down her spine, not from cold, but from the profound sense that something extraordinary was unfolding, something beyond any human control or comprehension. The night watchers, many of whom had documented decades of anomalies in the lighthouse's behavior, began to record every detail of the blue light. Its movement was deliberate, yet subtle, gliding across the cliffs with an almost sentient precision. It lingered over points of particular significance: the site of the old shipwrecks, the small coves where whispers beneath the waves had once been heard, and the harbor entrance that had saved countless vessels during storms. The blue glow seemed to acknowledge the town's history, its triumphs, and its losses, illuminating the landscape with an understanding that no human eye could produce alone. As hours passed, the blue lantern revealed more than beauty. It conveyed guidance. Fishermen navigating the inlets found the light outlining safe channels previously hidden in shadow, highlighting hazards that could have been fatal even to the most experienced. Some sailors claimed to feel subtle changes in the water beneath their vessels, as if the currents themselves responded to the light's presence. It was as though the lighthouse, having spent decades observing, learning, and protecting, had finally reached a point of deeper communication, a language of color, movement, and timing that the town was beginning to comprehend. Parents brought their children to the cliffs to witness the phenomenon. The blue glow became a shared experience, binding the community together through awe and curiosity. Stories of Elias Rowan, the night watchers, and the whispers beneath the waves resurfaced with renewed vigor. The town understood that this light was not merely ornamental or mechanical. It was purposeful, deliberate, and deeply tied to the legacy of the keeper who had devoted his life to vigilance and care. Children asked questions that adults could only partly answer, sensing intuitively that the light carried meaning and that understanding it required attention, patience, and respect. One particularly clear night, the blue lantern shifted in a pattern that mirrored the tides, rising and falling in concert with the waves. Lydia noted it in her journal, marking each subtle adjustment with meticulous detail. It was then that a realization began to form among the night watchers. The lighthouse was not merely guiding vessels. It was teaching the town to perceive the rhythms of the sea, to read the hidden cues, and to act in harmony with forces both natural and mysterious. The blue light was an invitation to understanding, a revelation of purpose beyond simple navigation. Local historians and elders joined the nightly gatherings, connecting the blue glow to Elias Rowan's letters, the rusted tin, and his final warnings. They recognized that the light's sudden transformation might signify the culmination of what he had begun. A lighthouse not only guided by human hands, but one that had absorbed knowledge, intention, and devotion, transmitting it through the subtle shifts of its lantern. The townsfolk felt both pride and humility, understanding that they were participants in an ongoing legacy rather than mere observers. Even skeptics felt the change. Sailors who had once dismissed the lighthouse as mechanical or ordinary found themselves navigating by the blue glow with careful respect. Its subtle guidance saved vessels from hidden reefs and shallow channels, reinforcing the notion that this light was more than a visual phenomenon. It was a living, teaching presence. Discussions broke out among fishermen, night watchers, and visitors alike, trying to decipher patterns and meaning, and in doing so, the town collectively began to internalize Elias's message. Vigilance, respect, and attentiveness to the unknown were as vital as skill and courage. As nights passed, the blue lantern did not waver. Its steady pulse became a rhythm the town learned to follow, aligning daily activities, safety measures, and fishing routines with its arcs and intensity. Residents reported subtle feelings of reassurance, calm, and clarity when observing the glow, as though the lighthouse had become a mentor, guiding not only vessels but the hearts and minds of the people who depended on it. Conversations around fireplaces, at the docks, and in homes often returned to the lantern, now seen as a teacher, guardian, and symbol of the intertwined fates of Whitestone and the sea. Lydia and the night watchers recorded the glow's every nuance, noting that it responded to storms, tides, and fog in ways that were distinct from the golden light they had known. The blue glow's presence seemed to signify moments of heightened awareness, offering subtle instructions to those who were willing to observe. The town began to recognize that the light's color change was not random. It was a deliberate signal, a tool of understanding left behind by Elias Rowan, a gift from the keeper who had once walked among them and now existed in the very soul of the lighthouse. By the time the first storm of the season approached, the town was prepared in a new way. They interpreted the blue glow as a guide, adjusting their routines and navigating with renewed confidence. The lighthouse's presence had shifted from passive illumination to active mentorship, an enduring beacon that bridged human care and the intelligence embedded in its structure by decades of devotion. The sea, once a force to be feared and endured, now offered lessons transmitted through the pulse of blue light, teaching the town to move with it rather than against it. Whitestone would never forget the night the lantern glowed blue for the first time. It marked a turning point, a moment when the town understood the depth of Elias Rowan's legacy, the intelligence of the lighthouse, and the subtle conversation between human effort and natural forces. The blue light, steady and alive, invited every observer to witness, to learn, and to respect not only the mechanics of navigation but the enduring bond between caretaker, community, and sea. In the years that followed, the blue lantern became a symbol of comprehension, reverence, and connection. Night watchers continued to study it, sailors relied on its guidance, and the town carried forward a collective memory of that extraordinary night. Children grew up knowing that the lighthouse was more than a tower. It was a teacher, a guardian, and a living testament to the dedication of a man who had devoted his life to understanding and protecting the delicate balance between Whitestone and the ocean that surrounded it. The blue glow endured, a quiet, ethereal promise that the town's vigilance would be rewarded, that the sea could be read and respected, and that the spirit of Elias Rowan, through the light he had nurtured and the lessons he had left behind, remained ever present, guiding, teaching, and illuminating the paths of those willing to watch, listen, and learn. The lighthouse stood against the horizon, its golden and blue beams cutting through mist and darkness, carrying the quiet weight of years, memories, and devotion long after Elias Rowan had vanished. Time had passed, and Whitestone had learned to live in harmony with the rhythms of the lighthouse. The townsfolk no longer merely relied on its light to navigate treacherous waters. They understood that the beacon itself had absorbed decades of vigilance, of observation, of care, and that it remembered in ways its human keeper could not. It was as if the structure itself had inherited Elias's devotion, preserving his knowledge and his unspoken promises. The sea remained wild and unpredictable, but the lighthouse had become a silent guardian, steady and wise beyond any human measure. Children who had grown up listening to tales of the whispers beneath the waves, the blue glow, and the night watcher's meticulous observations began to see the lighthouse as more than a building. They watched as the light swept over the cliffs and the harbor, noting how it paused at certain points, how it danced with the rise and fall of the tide, and how it seemed to anticipate dangers that even the most experienced sailors could not predict. The beacon had become a teacher, offering lessons without words, guiding without presence, and remembering the lives it had touched and saved. Old fishermen, hardened by years at sea, spoke of a change in their perception. They no longer saw the lighthouse as simply a tool, but as a companion, a sentinel that had absorbed the spirit of its keeper. They recounted nights when the waves were especially fierce, yet vessels followed the light safely to harbor, guided by an intelligence that seemed to belong to the lighthouse itself. They marveled at the way the beam lingered over hazards, highlighting rocks and shoals, as if Elias's memory lingered in the rotation of the lantern, ensuring that every life within its reach was protected. The night watchers, now passing their duties to a new generation, continued to record and reflect on the light's behavior. Lydia Marston, who had long since become the town's unofficial historian of the lighthouse, noted how the beacon retained knowledge of storms, tides, and the habits of vessels approaching the harbor. The structure remembered patterns, past dangers, and lives saved. Each observation reinforced the sense that the lighthouse was more than stone, metal, and glass. It was a repository of devotion, a guardian of memory, and a testament to the enduring influence of one man's dedication. Visitors to Whitestone often asked why the lighthouse seemed alive, why its beam moved with such purpose and foresight. The townsfolk would smile and explain gently, recounting the life of Elias Rowan. The letters found in a rusted tin, the blue glow that signaled deeper understanding, and the countless nights when the beam had guided lost or imperiled sailors. They described how the light had absorbed its keeper's attention and care, allowing it to act autonomously in ways that continued to protect and teach. Outsiders marveled, and while some attributed the phenomena to clever engineering or the natural behavior of light, those who lived in Whitestone knew that the truth was far richer and more mysterious. Storms continued to come and go, each one a test of the town's preparedness and the lighthouse's vigilance. Yet the beacon performed with the same quiet precision, as if aware not only of physical dangers, but also of the emotional currents running through the people who relied on it. The townsfolk had learned to trust its movements, to observe its pauses and shifts, and to interpret them as guidance shaped by memory. In this way, the lighthouse became a partner in survival, a guardian that never tired, never wavered, and never forgot. Evenings on the cliffs became moments of reflection rather than mere observation. Residents would gather, watching the golden and blue arcs sweep over the waves, feeling a calm assurance settle over them. They understood that the lighthouse remembered the past, the storms weathered, the lives saved, the secrets of the sea, and the devotion of Elias Rowan, and that it carried that memory forward as a promise. Children listened attentively, learning that vigilance, respect, and care could endure beyond a single lifetime, preserved in structures, traditions, and acts of unwavering attention. The lighthouse's memory extended beyond human comprehension. It recalled every warning, every saved life, every pattern in the tides and stars that its keeper had noted. It retained Elias's concern for the town, his meticulous attention to the sea, and his unspoken understanding of the mysterious currents, both literal and figurative, that shaped Whitestone's destiny. Residents felt a deep gratitude for this enduring presence, recognizing that the beacon was a living monument to devotion, a reminder that care extended beyond human limitations, and that memory, when nurtured with attention and love, could become a force of its own. Over time, the lighthouse became central to the town's identity, not only as a navigational aid, but as a guardian, a teacher, and a witness to generations. Weddings, anniversaries, and family gatherings often took place on the cliffs beneath its steady glow, and stories of the light's guidance became intertwined with personal histories. Elders would recount tales of storms survived, vessels rescued, and the subtle signs that the lighthouse had offered, instilling in children an awareness that safety and knowledge were gifts that could be shared and preserved, and that devotion could outlast a single lifetime. As Whitestone entered the modern era, with ships larger and technology more advanced, the lighthouse continued its quiet vigil. While radar and modern instruments could detect hazards, the townsfolk maintained a reverence for the beam that had remembered what its keeper could not. The light remained a symbol of continuity, care, and the extraordinary bond between human attention and the natural world. Residents understood that no instrument could replace the wisdom embedded in the lighthouse, that it carried lessons and memories no human hand could replicate, and that its presence was a gift forged from decades of devotion. In the quiet of night, when the wind stilled and the waves murmured against the cliffs, the lighthouse stood as it had for generations, a sentinel that remembered, guided, and nurtured. Its golden beams and occasional blue glow served as a reminder of what had been learned, and what must continue. Whitestone's people felt a calm assurance, knowing that the light embodied memory, devotion, and promise, and that in its unwavering vigilance, the legacy of Elias Rowan endured. The final understanding settled over the town like a gentle tide. The lighthouse was more than stone, glass, and oil. It was a guardian shaped by memory, a teacher guided by devotion, and a keeper of promises that outlived its human caretaker. Each beam, each sweep across the cliffs and harbor, carried the essence of decades of care and attention. Whitestone had learned to see not only with their eyes, but with their hearts, interpreting the lighthouse's movements as wisdom preserved and transmitted across time. And so Whitestone thrived under the glow of a beacon that remembered, guiding generations with lessons etched into its very structure, a sentinel that had absorbed the essence of a man, who had devoted his life to watching, caring, and remembering. The lighthouse's light, steadfast and unwavering, continued to illuminate the cliffs, the harbor, and the hearts of those who lived and worked under its eternal vigil, ensuring that devotion, memory, and promise would endure beyond the limits of a single lifetime.